Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is from the incredible mind of DylanSkeldrum over on Reddit No Sleep. As ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. Why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled One of Our Cattle Started Biting. Let's get straight into that. I live in a small, tight-knit rural community in the Scottish Highland Territories. Obviously I won't disclose exactly where, but all you really need to understand is how out of the way we are. Miles and miles of roads winding around endless hills, burns and lochs separate us from the nearest town where any brand name stores operate. My mum and dad are farmers, but in a more rustic sense. Think subsistence farming, with a little bit of good faith selling and trading with the nearest neighbours. In the north of Scotland, cell phone and internet coverage is unreliable at the best anywhere outside of your own home. My auntie and uncle visit every now and then from Glasgow. If I want anything, I can get it sent up here. We're not all that disconnected with modern day technology and postage. But anyway, I only told you all that to give you a little sense and a bit of context towards my situation and feel for where we are. We have some sheep and chickens, but mostly our pride and joy has been our cows. We keep them happy, and they've plenty of space to roam and have good lives. We genuinely care about them. My dad especially, even after 50 years of heading a farm, and he still hates having to slaughter any of them. Big softy, he is. Something most people don't know about cows is that they tend to stay in barns during the day, if they have the chance, and then head out to the pasture at night. One evening about 2 weeks ago, we were at the table for a late dinner when we heard one of the cows crying out louder above the usual bustle. When a cow is in pain or especially scared, it cries out in this weird whining scream. It's high-pitched. Me and my dad gave each other a look and grabbed our torches and went out into the field with our collie Kira to try and see what it was. When we reached them, the beams of the old flashlight swept across the scattered herd. Most of them still moving and giving these scared moves. No matter how long we work on a farm, it's always unnerving being out there at night. All those big animals with their eyes reflecting with that ghostly green glow. And quickly, I spotted one amongst the herd. Nell, with a damp red glistening wound on her neck. Me and my dad spent a little time getting close to her, but it took a while because she was understandably skittish. And finally, getting a closer look, I felt my heart drop and my stomach turn when we saw it. A bite. A big one. Another thing you need to know about Scottish cows is that they don't have any natural predators. The foxes are too small and the wolves and bears, or they died off decades ago. So nothing could have or should have done this. We heard Kira growling, and turning the flashlight to her we saw her low to the ground and baring her teeth, face pointed towards the far corner of the field. We turned our beams and stood there, still as a stone, was one of our cows. It was eerie seeing it just standing there, unmoving and staring back at us. According to light, it wasn't hard to see that its lips and chin, or they were wet with blood. My dad looked at it with his mouth partially open and eyes narrowed, placing a hand on my shoulder and stepping in front of me. It was Clara Bell, one of the larger of the herd, who was a couple of months into her pregnancy. We never had aggression in our animals before, just the odd nip and shove. She must be sick, muttered my dad, before adding, "Take Kira inside." The words came through me, but it felt frozen, as still as that cow. She was looking dead at me, those reflective eyes a sheer pale green that bored into my soul and sent chills down my spine, as I watched a single red bead of blood trickle down her lips. My dad shook me softly, repeating himself a little more firmly, which woke me from my stupor. Nodding, I tore myself away from the cow's stare and pulled the disgruntled collie away and back up to the house. It was only on that return trip that I realized how hard my heart was racing, thumping away in my chest. Something about the whole situation just felt off, and I hated leaving my dad alone back there. I told my mum what had happened and explained everything, leaving her as confused as me and my dad. But thankfully, it wasn't long before he came back in, announcing he'd gotten her back and locked her and the bitten one, now in separate pens in the barn, away from the others. He'd call a vet and see if we could get the herd checked in case there was some kind of disease going about, and needless to say, I did not sleep easy that night. Laid in bed, all I could think of was the look in its eyes, the intensity and intent I could feel behind it. I love animals and I don't scare easy, but this felt different, felt wrong. After a few good hours of tossing and turning, struggling to keep the cows off my mind, sleep finally took me. I woke with a start to the sound of my dad shouting from downstairs. Frantically, I rolled out of bed and shoved on some clothes and stumbling down the steps with a nervous lump in my throat for what could have happened now. It was early, a cold amber tinting on the highlands from the sunrise peeking through the cloudy grey sky. The front door was lying open, and so I hurried outside and spotted the herd standing in the middle of the field looking towards the farmhouse, all making distressed mooing sounds. I saw my mum stood in front of the open barn doors, covering her mouth with her hands, a look of shock in her eyes. Nervously I stepped forward till I laid eyes on it too. The sight made my gut rise, my hand coming to grip onto the barn door to support my legs, which felt like they were about to give out from under me as I tried not to vomit. On the left side of the barn, the wooden stool separating Clarabelle from the cow she'd bitten had been smashed through. The wood splintered and broken. In the pen, Clarabelle was stood over the mess that was Nell, mouth full of bloody meat. The dead animal's throat was torn open, her blood spattered across the wall and hay-covered floor from where it had been ripped out. It wasn't just that though. Her stomachs, they were eaten too. A gaping hole where her gut was still warm and strewn with gore. Before I turned away, I was fairly sure I saw the partway eaten body of a fetal calf amongst it all. The way she was moving to take each bite and swallow it was unnervingly quick and erratic. Nothing like a cow's usual lazy motions. I couldn't stomach another look. The sound of meat being torn and chewed by blunt teeth. The offensive coppery smell of blood filling my senses as I struggled to not hyperventilate. It was then I heard my dad yelling, and having grabbed a pitchfork, I began trying to force Clarabelle back from the body, and it took him physically prodding her to even get her to step back. And speaking loudly, he told my mum to call our neighbour, Horace, and get him to come around and bring his rifle. She ran back to the scene in a hurry, but I was still frozen as I watched my dad shout and fend back the bloodied animal. Clarabelle swallowed with gross gulping noises, and as soon as she had nothing left to chew on, she moved forward towards the corpse again. "Hey!" my dad yelled at her, thrusting forward the pronged pitchfork in an effort to scare the cow back, but she completely ignored him. She was strong, the strength behind her movements knocking the makeshift weapon out of my father's hands as she forced her way back to the corpse of Nell. When she finally reached it, she immediately bit down again into the pit of the dead cow's stomach. But when she opened her mouth, it was wider than I'd ever seen a cow's mouth open before. Clarabelle made this horrid noise, like someone with a hoarse breath breathing inwards. My dad took a few slow steps back, watching in horror as the terrible feeding continued. I was still stood in the doorway to the barn while this was happening. Glancing back to the house, I could see my frantic-looking mum looking out the window at us from the kitchen, on the phone, talking to someone who I guessed to be Horace. I heard my dad mutter something, drawing my attention back towards the broken stools. "What in God's name?" He had gone pale, a look of confused disgust and fear on his face. Instinctually, I looked to follow his gaze, and I saw it too. I felt the breath leave my shaking body, limbs and chest going cold. I'd mentioned before that Clarabelle was pregnant, but we could see her belly distending. It was moving, shifting as if something was pressing against it from the inside. Her abdomen becoming visibly larger and the skin thinner as she fed, but the thing pressing against her from the inside, it didn't at all look like a calf. It looked like an arm, a hand pushing outwards for a moment. I took a few faltering steps back, but my dad turned to me and began storming away from the scene, moving past me and marching to the storage shed. When he re-emerged, he was carrying a jerry can of petrol, and the look on his face, it was terrifying. It was his God-fearing anger, like he was hellishly intent on righting what we could both see was so wrong. Now he walked right past me, into the barn, and immediately began splashing it onto Clarabelle on the stools, the sound of her horrid breathing and crunching and swallowing still permeating the chamber. The thing in her stomach still growing and convulsing, and the smell of petrol and blood mixed potently as my dad emptied the can out and into a trail which led past where I stood away a few feet from the barn. He closed the doors and pulled the latch, locking it before lighting a match. And he hesitated for just a second, looking at me as if to check what was happening was even real. All I could give him in return was a pale-faced, pleading expression. He dropped the match and lit an instant tall flame, following the trail of gasoline quickly with a dull cracking roar. He dropped the match lit in an instant tall flame, following the trail of gasoline quickly with a dull crackling roar, right up and under the slight gap beneath the barn doors. It was full of hay and dry wood in there, and we both knew that soon enough it would be engulfed, along with whatever was that inside. I stepped back as it intensified, feeling the heat coming off of it and watching the smoke billowing upwards. I could feel the tension in my chest, like I was waiting for something to happen. But even as I smelled burning meat, the pain bovine cries I was expecting, they never came. As I was about to let out a breath I'd been holding, a sudden, ungodly shrieking started, and I ran. I ran away as the sound burst forth from the flaming barn, even as my dad stood firm outside the barn doors. I ran as hard as the horribly pained mix of animal and human wailing from inside the inferno. I couldn't take any more. I ran inside the house, straight to the bathroom, dropped in front of the toilet, and was sick. It was hours before the fire burned out, and there was nothing left of the barn but charred wood and ash, and the bones of the cows. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel safe out here again, because my dad told me something that I'll never forget for as long as I live. He saw something escape the fire.